Welcome back. I'm really excited about this panel. We have some great folks with us today. You know, I often hear from the industry, how can we build trust with the public? And what is the path forward to safety? And, you know, there's a lot of answers there, one of which we'll talk about the next session on public engagement. But one answer that I always share when asked that question is R&D. We really hope that advancements in leak detection can tell us when the product's not staying in the pipe, that advancements in anomaly detection and inline inspection can let us know when we need to repair a pipe, and development in valves will help mitigate disasters when those failures do happen. So we find ourselves looking to R&D now, as you know, Congress has incentivized these new generation of pipelines of CO2 and hydrogen, which of course have been moved in pipelines for a while, but we're looking at a new scale. And so we're lucky to have some of the leaders in pipeline safety R&D with us today. And it's their job to find ways to make pipelines safer. And you know, one thing we always like to come back to in this panel, or this conference, is that we are all here to get to zero incidents, and this is one way that we do that. So I want to give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves. I'm going to keep going alphabetically, so I'm going to start with Cliff Johnson from PRCI.
Thanks, Bill. And I just want to appreciate the opportunity to be here. This is an impressive organization to see, bringing government together with the public and the industry. This is the partnership that we should be having consistently. We're all on the same goal, and that one goal is to keep the product in the line. That's really what we're all trying to work towards. So my name is Cliff Johnson, and I am the president of the Pipeline Research Council International. We were founded in 1952, and we were founded by a handful of operators trying to solve one problem that they had at the time. And they realized through that effort the value of collaboration, the opportunity to work together to really pull us to a safer, better environment. Over the last 70 plus years, we've continued to do that, and continue to do that strongly across the globe. We have members in all corners of the world, across the universe. It doesn't really matter where you are. If there's a piece of steel on the ground, we need to make sure it's maintained and run effectively. We have great partnerships with industry, with the public, working with the government agencies both here in the US, in Canada, and around the world to really begin sharing what is technically feasible and where we go. Let me give you a little bit of a brief story about PRCI. We do research on energy transport and storage. And we look at all forms of energy, from natural gas to fuels, to biofuels, to CO2, to hydrogen. Very diversified thing, and we've been doing this for many, many years. If you go back and look through the PRCI records, you'll find some of the earliest hydrogen transport and storage research is done by our organization. So as Bill said, as we move into hydrogen and CO2, this isn't brand new stuff. We've actually done quite a bit of research to help us get to that point. We also have a very large amount of the pipelines considerably compared to the rest of the world for hydrogen and CO2 in the United States. And now, scale-wise, it's not a huge amount. It's only 6,000 miles and 12,000 miles between the two. But it is probably the most in the world at any one location that's being run right now today. This provides PRCI kind of a unique framework to see energy transport and storage as an opportunity as we move forward. The research that we do has importance only when we are able to share it and implement it across the board. Those who know me will hear me say quite often that good research leads to good standards, which leads to good regulations. And that's kind of the concept we want to keep here. We want to make sure we're doing the research that allows us to understand what is possible, put it out for industry practice, grow it into industry standards, and then if we need to, move it to regulations to allow our industry to continue to flourish and move forward. That is really one of those critical factors. Through PRCI, we're fortunate to be able to work with some of the leading thought leaders, not only here in the US, but around the globe, on how to solve some of these key challenges. We're being pressed more to find new ideas and new thinkers on how this new space. One of the things we work into is how do we find the next generation of researchers? Where do we need to go? And it's a key question we all need to think about is how do we allow ourselves to encourage others to come in behind us? Many of us have talked about today some of the challenges we have in our industry and some of the negative impacts that people have seen. Well, that has led to a degradation and a reduction in the number of students who want to go into our field. Well, that's not a positive thing. That's actually extremely negative. Pipelines are the safest mode of transportation for energy products, period. That steel needs to be maintained for today and into the future, no matter what product we're moving. And if we don't have an educated and refined workforce coming in, we have some long-term challenges. We need to do a better job of educating those that the opportunity is there to come in and join us in this research. And as I mentioned, PRCI is truly international. We have members all across the globe. When you look at PRCI's membership and our collaborative partners, we represent roughly 60% of the world's transmission pipeline. 60% of the world's transmission pipeline is in PRCI. That's a great opportunity, but also a great responsibility to ensure we identify and then execute the right research. So we're very excited to be here to really help add some to the story about the research that we're doing, where the industry is going. As Bill said, the goal is zero. But to get there, the research is critical to continue to allow us to continue to move into this space. So Bill, thanks for the opportunity. Look forward to the other discussions today.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. I'm only using this podium because the light's a little nicer on my eyes than when I'm sitting down here.
That's cheating. That's cheating. It's too bright.
Next, let's hear from Max Kieba at PHMSA.
About to say I might need like a welder's helmet.
Surely.
But Max Kieba, currently director of program development at PHMSA. So we kind of, my division kind of does a little bit of technical, a little bit of policy, and also data analysis, which I wish I was in a data committee, but it is what it is. But R&D kind of brings me back home. One of my first, before PHMSA, I was about 8 years in R&D. I'm a recovering electrical engineer. A lot of math involved, but I did a lot of wireless sensor design, plastic materials, composites, and those aspects. And then for about 10 or 12 years with PHMSA with our engineering and research division, since I moved to my new role about a year ago. So I'm primarily representing our great team of our R&D team, which right now at a high level we have about 4 main areas. We do our core R&D program, which is the one that's been standing for a while. It's probably our largest program. The other part we have are what's called competitive academic agreement programs, where we basically fund universities directly. The idea being, let's fund universities directly and also help get our, the issue we have with aging workforce, get some of the students involved more in pipeline aspects. We also have a small business innovative research program, SBIR, and then we also have interagency agreements. Pretty modest budget overall. I want to say our budget is roughly $13 million, which might sound a lot initially, but when you think about all the portfolio of R&D we're doing, it gets spread pretty thin pretty quick. We do have some cost sharing, which I might get into, but some of those aspects. Bill asked about some of our priorities, and I think Alan touched on it a little bit with his opening remarks. We have been looking at some of the regular areas through the years. We looked at like threat prevention, anomaly detection and repair, some of the aspects like continuing to improve inline inspection. But we are looking at some of these newer areas like, we do have a couple existing projects in carbon dioxide, but we're looking at CO2, hydrogen. Leak detection continues to be of interest. Alan kind of talked about our little shift in focus with methane reduction, but continuing to look at leak detection in general, both on main pipelines and then the other area. Alan touched a little bit, we're standing up an LNG Center of Excellence, so that's going to have an R&D component specific to LNG as well. So that's probably some of our main priorities right now, but we'll talk about it a little bit more.
Okay, thanks, Max. And we'll hear from Tony Lindsay at GTI Energy.
Thanks. Thank you, Bill, and glad to be here. Am I coming through here? Okay. Glad to be on the panel with these folks. We collaborate and work together quite a bit. Max mentioned his research program, and we've been the recipient through competitive solicitation of several of those program dollars, doing great work. A little bit about me first to let you know where I'm coming from. 39 years in the energy industry. I started out with a natural gas local distribution company outside of Chicago. Was at Nicor Gas for about 18 years. I spent 4 or 5 years in the energy consulting business, and then I've been now at GTI Energy for about 17 years. The first 12 or so, I ran our natural gas vehicle program, but then I got back into my roots of being involved with the operations of gas distribution. So now lead a group of about 45 to 50 scientists, engineers, and technicians that focus their efforts on research surrounding more safe and effective and environmentally friendly operations of pipeline systems. GTI Energy, if you're not familiar with us, we're a nonprofit R&D organization, been around about 80 years, and we've run research throughout the whole value chain, from energy generation to conversion to movement to storage, and also technologies involved in the use of energy. In total, we've got about 450 folks, and about half of those work out of our headquarters outside of Chicago in Des Plaines, Illinois, where we have working labs, both benchtop as well as at full scale. And the balance of our folks are in offices in California, Texas, DC, and several in the Northeast. We have a very diverse, fortunately to have a diverse set of sponsors that fund our work. About a third of our work comes from federal government, like the Department of Energy, Department of Defense. About a third is from those natural gas local distribution companies I mentioned. And then the balance is either private industry funded or state and local governments. We do a very good job of leveraging those against each other so that the gas utility programs we run can be used to cost share some of the federal programs that are out there. We've run several collaborative initiatives. Cliff mentioned the word collaboration. That's what we're about as well. And it works out real well. Our operations technology development collaboration in particular has about 27 member companies and organizations, but they represent about 60 million gas meters around the U.S. So it's 70% or so of the gas companies. And our priorities fall in line with what the industry's priorities are there: safety, integrity, improving reliability, being cost effective, and environmentally friendly. I guess I'll pause there and get into the questions.
Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Before we get into the first question, just one thing. Cliff, you said that pipelines are the safest method of transportation, period. And, we could have a whole panel on this. Maybe this is an idea for another year, but I would say rather than period, it might be an asterisk or a comma, because when a pipeline does fail, the amount that can be released it goes beyond what is capable of rail or a truck. And so while the incident rate per mile might be lower on pipelines, and there's other safety metrics where they're no doubt the safest, there's that potential for catastrophe that you don't necessarily have with other methods. So I would think instead of period, maybe an asterisk.
The period, I like the period, but you make a good point. When there is a pipeline failure, there is an opportunity for comparatively more releases. You're correct.
Okay, well, maybe I'll mark that down. Maybe it's a good topic for next year. So first off, and any of you go in any order you'd like, can you describe some safety successes that have come out of your organization's research programs?
Should we go down the line? Probably be easiest. Sure. Well, some that come to mind to me, we've worked on, well, as many know, third-party damage is one of the most significant threats to pipeline operations. And so one example is a technology that's utilized with horizontal directional drilling equipment during the construction of smaller diameter pipelines. In particular, I'm talking, and this is a obstacle identification device. So it goes on the head of the rig, and it can look for things like a sewer line or another energy carrying line or an electric conduit, for example, and instruct the operator to vary the course. So it's been demonstrated quite effectively. In fact, it's now being picked up by the electric industry as they try to move their assets from above ground to more underground over the years. So that's one that I like to promote and make folks aware of. We've done quite a bit of work on sensor development to look for intrusions into pipeline right-of-ways. There's a lot of ways of trying to tackle this and give early warning, things like fiber optics, but our work has been primarily looking at signature vibrations and sounds on a pipeline structure or from point to point with sensor work. I'll give one more that we're excited about, and that is a vacuum purge system that when putting a pipe into service, most conventional method of doing this is to get the air out of the line and put 100% of the product into the line. In the gas operations is simply to get turbulent flow and mix that and vent it until 100% natural gas is present. What we've come up with is a way to draw a vacuum on the newly installed system such that when natural gas is introduced, it can be done without having to vent at all, because you're ensured that you don't have oxygen in the environment to get to a combustible level. So that's right now we're trying to find commercialization partners to push that out into more common practice.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. I heard a little bit about that project from someone else at GTI Energy at Western Regional Gas Conference, and yeah, it was really, really exciting to someone who's worried about methane emissions on the kind of standard operating of a pipeline that there's potentially this other answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, safety is the driver behind our research program, as all this group will talk about here. So when you look at what is some successes, there's a very long list I could go through today, and I'm not going to do that. But there's some key areas I'll talk about that I noticed from the agenda we can talk on. Leak detection. The last session in this room was about advanced leak detection. Both those technologies that were being presented were research that PRCI was able to participate in, execute, and validate the technologies for where they can go. PRCI's leak detection program is from along the pipeline, as Tony was mentioning, with fiber optics, as well as ground-based, looking at automobile and human traffic, as well as then begin looking at fixed wing and right-of-way, looking at drones and helicopters, all the way up to satellites and looking at satellites and how do we use the data from across the system. All these technologies have been worked through and validated through PRCI and the membership there. We also have some strong things in geohazard and how to set up your systems and how to respond to ground movements and the things that are there. New sensors on how to detect the movement and where to place pipelines. There's a whole program on routing, where to put a pipe in the most efficient way to effectively do it. One of the more recent tools we just completed is a CO2e calculation tool that allows the industry and the operators to begin figuring out where their most methane reductions, or excuse me, CO2 releases may be and how to address them most effectively. And so those are some of the technologies you begin to see put into practice by PRCI and our members to help create a safer, more efficient pipeline system.
Yeah, I'll expand a little bit on other areas we've been looked at. So high level, at the macro level, sometimes our modern R&D program starts around 2002, but we've had about 400 projects, close to 200 million. But usually the challenge sometimes is getting that tech transfer. So it's one thing to do the R&D, but are people actually using it? But we've had, we've at least helped result in commercialization of 35 technologies. Some of these range from inline inspection, which I think both Tony and Cliff talked about, but some of that was part of like really small diameter, currently unpiggable lines. Can you get like a really small tool to help go into there? So we've helped commercialize some of those technologies. Some other areas we looked at are excavation damage continues to be an issue of a leading cause. So we've supported some technologies to help commercialize that helps get like a 3D mapping of particularly multiple utilities in a really congested area. So those are just some examples. And then we also help fund research that helps inform some of our standards that incorporated by reference in our federal codes. We have some 43 different industry standards. And then it helps inform rulemaking. So, we learned a lot. CO2 is just one example. We learned from the public meeting. There's one piece, okay, what can we do with rulemaking? But there's another piece is where do we need to look to improve R&D as a continued process improvement? Another example is like leak detection. So, we've supported, for example, leak detection is looking at other aspects of methane emissions and others, but we helped, some of our R&D help fund or help provide information into the leak detection. So those are just some examples of different areas we looked at. Yeah.
Great, thanks. In what area would you say you see either the most or the biggest knowledge gaps in pipeline safety? Where's the most work to be done?
Yeah, one of the things that we're looking at is the use of data. As individual companies, we're relatively data smart. As an industry, we haven't really availed ourselves of the data's opportunity. To give you an example, many years ago in the aviation industry, back in the late 80s, early 90s here in the United States, we had some issues with the planes not being as effective and efficient as we needed them to be. They were landing in the wrong spots. So Congress said that's a really bad idea. Please don't do that anymore. How do we do this differently? And how do we prevent these crashes and make airworthiness more safely? They allowed for the commingling of data from various operators to become more intelligent on what the challenges and issues were. Our industry has the same opportunity to come together and pull the resources across our industry. The data in the individual companies is pretty smart, as I said, and there's a lot of resident knowledge. But if we can cross multiple operators and to bring the data in together, this is where the next big opportunity for significant refinement is going to be in our discussions, is how do we do that? This is currently being discussed at the congressional level right now in an effort called the Voluntary Information Sharing Effort. This was started by PHMSA several years ago after a congressional directive on how do they begin pooling and sharing data. PRCI has already begun a virtual technology center to begin doing just that, bringing data together. So I think this is going to be the next really big opportunity to see some significant changes in how research is done, where do we need to look, and how do we better understand the key challenges facing our industry. So I think data for us at least is going to be one of the next big opportunities to really shift our industry.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. A little follow-up before we move on to the others. A couple questions, like what kind of data specifically are we talking about? Is it data from ILI runs? Is it other data? And then my second follow-up would be, is there a role for AI in analyzing this data?
Yeah, both great questions. So the data is going to range, and we're looking to bring basically all data in, and beginning with some of the larger things with inline inspection data, which could be terabytes of data. Looking at NDE tools, non-destructive evaluation tools, which is complementary external outside the pipe to inline inspection, which goes through the pipe. There is a need for all of this data to come together, and there's a number of ways of doing it. The big area that we like to work with PHMSA on is how do we get more near-miss data, because that's really the secret sauce. If we can get the near-miss stories, we can help get ahead of and be more predictive, and so that's kind of the data we're looking for. So at the end of the day, this is going to be huge data lakes we're going to be working through and culling through, but then an opportunity for us to really assess and how to use that. These databases should be publicly available, and what we're going to do is de-identify the contributors, because we don't want to be a gotcha game for someone who's trying to be beneficial, but we do want to begin making better decisions off the information. The second question is about artificial intelligence, most assuredly. It's built and created just for this kind of behavior, so now we need to do is figure out how to train it properly, how to ask the right questions of it, and how to use it, but AI definitely has a key role in this.
Great, thanks. Who's next?
Well, I'll jump in and say that much like the technology gap that Cliff described came about because of change in technology available to the industry, gaps also come about because of change in our operations. And so with the desire of operators to decarbonize the natural gas industry, there's, as we all know, investigations into blending hydrogen into the system, repurposing natural gas lines for lower carbon or no carbon fuels. And so a gap that we're working on is materials compatibility. The answer usually comes back to it depends when asked. Is a system ready for a change to a low or no carbon fuel? So materials compatibility testing. There's fortunately some good work going on at the national level. You heard about the High Blend project perhaps, and the national labs are putting a lot of effort into that. The role that we see GTI Energy playing is taking the findings coming out of that work at the national labs level and helping to operationalize it, helping the operators understand, okay, that we see the data, we see the findings, but what's that mean to my operation? Does that mean I have to change my frequency of inspection, or do I have to look for a different size anomaly now? So that's the gap that we're trying to close.
Yeah. As you transition to new fuels and CO2, which is not a fuel but a byproduct, the next energy products that we push through the lines are going to have a series of educations that we need to go through. Material properties is the first one, because the design of our current systems was to mitigate and reduce having hydrogen in the lines. That was the whole purpose for the last 75 years of our operations, is to reduce hydrogen in the lines. And now we're going to infuse it into the lines. How do you do that effectively and efficiently? Both GTI and PRCI has set up groups within our organizations to address this. LCRI, the Low Carbon Resource Initiative for GTI, and then the Emerging Fuels Institute for PRCI, to begin exploring these kind of questions. And once you understand material properties, how do our current technologies, looking at inline inspection, operate in these new environments? Because there's a difference, there's a change. When you look to CO2, the same kind of things. As I mentioned earlier, hydrogen and CO2 aren't new to our industries. We've done it before. But as Bill pointed out, it's the volume, the amount we're going to be looking for is vastly different. And so the pressures we're talking about for CO2, not something we've done before. Looking at hydrogen, the amount of hydrogen we're going to be shipping. DOE just recently released their hydrogen hubs about a month ago now. That's a pretty significant play, $8 billion into the industry to help facilitate a hydrogen economy. Where does this go exactly? How do we do this? So there's a really unique opportunity that both groups are looking at aggressively. How do we make sure our industry is prepared for it and can drive the discussion? At PRCI, we do have members currently who have been dictated that by 2026 in Europe, they're going to be moving 100% hydrogen in their current assets. There's a lot of really cool questions left to be answered. There's also a lot of opportunities for us to begin doing the right thing as soon as we possibly can to ensure that safe delivery, because there's no options they have in this country, because the government has said you will be moving hydrogen by 2026. So those are some really unique things short term that we need to make sure we get our hands around. So good point.
Yeah, no, for our gaps, we speak more from the perspective of our, we just recently had a public R&D forum at the end of October, beginning of November. If anyone hasn't seen it, you can go to Google PHMSA's R&D forum. We had at least 250 people attend in person, about 400 online. We had 6 working groups which were tied to some of the priorities I mentioned earlier, but each of the working groups probably came up with about 35 to 50 different gaps. And I'm not going to list them all here, but you can go online. But I will say there was definitely considerable interest in CO2 for sure. Some of the discussions we already have had here as we shift from enhanced oil recovery to some of the direct air capture type technologies with different, how does that affect the infrastructure? How does it affect, tied into other things like threat identification with, potentially different ways to look at the materials and different, it's called equations of state, but also different specifications you have to put into place or standards depending on the material that's being transported, the exact makeup of that CO2, whether it's liquid, gas, regardless of the various phases, which can also change things like cycling effects and things like that. So those kind of things are looked at as well. Hydrogen is having some interest, particularly with the shift or looking at more blending, potentially 100% hydrogen in some cases, and going to those aspects. And then, continuing to improve leak detection, threat identification, and looking at some of that. And material considerations are of interest too. Is it always, sometimes the newest material isn't always the best for some of these projects. Hydrogen's one example where hydrogen has an embrittlement issue. So there's kind of a sweet spot of maybe what's the right material to use. Again, a tie into our public meeting, things like crack arrest. What happens if there's a CO2 release, for example? As it changes those phases pretty quickly, you have that really quick cooling, freezing effect that happens, and could that potentially have a rupture that can continue further along? So questions like what are the right materials, either in a pipeline itself, but for instance, one discussion came up at our R&D forum on things like, can you put composite materials for crack arresters that can potentially help some of that as well. So those are just some examples of gaps we looked at. And then it goes into a big mixing bowl of how do we come out with different topics we'll put out. Is it part of the next research solicitation? Does it go into maybe the academic agreement program? Is it some of the interagency agreements? There's at least one we're working on with DOE, which I might talk about a little bit later. Yeah, maybe we, and part of it is how do we be most creative on, trying not to duplicate efforts with whether it's industry, other governments, things like that. We're even looking at potentially working with United Kingdom. They're doing some work over there, including with some universities here in the States, but can we work together with other governments as well on how to help work together on joint industry projects and things like that, so.
Great. So as you all know, one of the goals of this conference is to really lift up the public voice. And so I want to ask the three of you how you see what is the public's role in R&D, and if there is one, and how do we contribute to these priorities?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a role with the public. And I kind of talked a little bit some of the other panels. I think we're getting definitely into more of a shift of a much more educated, knowledgeable public in general. It used to be, oh, this is way above the public's heads, this is too far in the weeds, they're not going to understand any of that. I think we need to shift that kind of mindset and culture a little bit. I think the public is definitely really knowledgeable in some of the issues we're having. So the more we can have public input onto some of these, and we're trying to learn better too ourselves, like we are trying to do more virtual access on some of these, but we definitely want to make sure the public has public input. When an R&D project is completed, we usually conduct a report out meeting. We do invite others to listen in, and we try to reach out to the Pipeline Safety Trust to say, hey, by the way, we're having this project. We have a portal. We have a public portal that even if you can't go to our normal R&D forums that happen, we also have a 24/7 gap solicitation website that anyone can go to where you can just put in an idea saying, hey, there's a gap here. Can you look at it as well? So we might look into that for the next forum. Some of those aspects. And then, yeah, again, I'll tie it back to the R&D, the Iowa meeting, but we incorporated some of those common research gaps that we heard from that public meeting and kind of helped funneled it into it. So we'd love to have more public input at our actual meetings and attendance, but I know sometimes that's a challenge depending on where it is, where it goes, but we're trying to look at different aspects on how to provide more input.
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think the public is a critical part of the story, so it's a partnership really, because our goals are the same as I said before, to keep the product in line. It's really the underlying story. Getting the public involved is that key step, so the public, the government, and the industry needs to work together. On our website, you'll be able to find our research roadmaps. Now, admittedly, they're very technical, but it does give you a blueprint of what the industry is looking at and where they're going. So if you go on our homepage, there'll be a publicly accessible research roadmap. Also, we have the opportunity for anybody to submit a research idea. So at any point in time in the process, anybody can submit an idea saying, hey, we have concerns about, we want you to think about at any point in time. So I'd encourage you to begin thinking about what are your concerns and how do you engage the industry? We need to know the feedback. We're as smart as the ideas that come into PRCI, and so the more ideas we get, the smarter we're going to be. So we'd appreciate and look forward to your input. We spend a lot of time with PHMSA, the R&D Forum, and other forums. Department of Energy is in the back of the room as well. We spend time with the Department of Energy talking about their strategy and their vision, trying to make sure we can invest the money wisely. In safety, there isn't really us versus them. We're all in the same boat together, and so the more we can work together, the better, the stronger the systems are going to be. So that's really, hopefully we can get more public input into these things. So, Bill, congratulations on the forum. It's the split you showed in the beginning. Very impressive, and very good to see that. That was almost, like you said, a one-for-one industry and public. Good job.
Yeah, well said. I echo all of that. I'll give one additional opportunity for public input that we value, and I'll point back to these collaboratives that we run, and the one collaborative that's made up of local distribution companies, where they pool their R&D, some of their R&D dollars with GTI Energy to address the priorities, and those funds come from the ratepayers, and their ratepayers have an opportunity to let their public utility commissions know that they support those R&D programs. So that's a way the public can help as well. And state energy offices have workshops where they solicit input for how their programmatic dollars will be spent. So that's We attend those, and hopefully the public does too, and we get good ideas that way.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. There have been some studies, and it was talked a little bit about in the leak detection panel on distribution systems specifically, about there's been these studies that show that there are a higher concentration of leaks or more pipeline failures in disadvantaged communities and communities of color. And so to find a more equitable state of pipeline safety, how do we ensure that the benefits of these R&D projects, the safety benefits, are felt equitably among our communities?
I might start. One of the big initiatives our R&D group did was reach out to what's called minority serving institutions, MSIs. But we reached out to over 200 minority MSIs, minority serving institutions, and part of our CAP program, particularly university program, just different information sessions about here's some of our programs, how to apply. Even things like we're learning, like it's difficult to even understand how to apply for our solicitations, and how do we stack up with another potentially solicitor or a proposer that maybe has more experience. So, but some of those aspects kind of helped us see, well, one, helping to improve the workforce in general, but also just looking how, making sure even applying for our grants or our proposals is equitable in itself, how to do that. So we did some of that, reaching out to the MSIs, which ties into some of our DOT strategic goals of equity and some of those aspects, but it also include helping targeting some of those disadvantaged or underrepresented communities to make sure they're at least part of this, as part of the long-term vision of eventually, looking at some of the technologies that can have equity impacts in different disadvantaged areas, but also the students as well, to make sure they're growing and learning. And yes, we acknowledge I wasn't able to make the leak detection because it was competing, but I don't know if it was mentioned that the 2022 Colorado State University findings that did talk about some of that. So we acknowledge some of that is definitely happening. So we're looking at different aspects like leak detection. It's not really an R&D piece, but another thing is talking about how do we even inspect in some of those areas. There was a concern that even when our inspectors try to go in for safety, sometimes there's not a fond reaction to government coming in. They don't know if we're coming in for safety or are we a law enforcement agency. So we're even trying to figure out from our inspection standpoint is how do we go in and try to convince the community that we're trying to come in for safety reasons. And that's a whole other public engagement aspect, which I know is another panel, but how do you reach out to the some of the trusted community leaders, things like that, to help kind of connect those dots as well, because sometimes there's just still this lack of trust with the federal government in general, but we're trying to help bridge some of those gaps as an example.
You just got to say we're the government, we're here to help. That's all. But no, when you look at this, the real opportunity here is transparency. The more people know what's available, the more they can ask for. So the more transparent we are with the research results and the information, either through a PHMSA activity, GTI, or PRCI, the more some of these communities will know what they can ask for. Because if you don't know is even possible, you don't even know what you should be talking about. And so how do we engage with that communications? Similar to PHMSA, we've begun working with more of these minority institutions as well, and begin reaching out to some of those universities. In Houston, we have our Technology Development Center. It's about 8.5 acres. Some of our members call it the Engineers Playground. And we've had several universities bring their students over to see firsthand what pipelines look like and to see how they operate and what they can learn from it and how they can bring stuff back for their programs. Some of those students have gone with jobs and careers in our industry, others have not. But that's really what you want to begin doing. But part of back to your question of how do we help those communities, it's really sharing information, the transparency of what has been done so they can ask the right questions and be able to seek that out. There's a lot of work still to be done to ensure that's just the safety across the board, but we need to make sure they know what's coming and how they can access it. And then encouraging conversations. Again, having forums in those communities is the best way for us to have that opportunity to share with them what we're doing. So hopefully we can bring, instead of being this beautiful Sheraton hotel, maybe next time we're someplace different where we can bring communities closer to us to have the conversation with them as well. So just changing our paradigm in how we do this and really try it again, have that showing of what we want to do and be intentional about it. And that's what we can do.
Yeah, I guess I'm looking at it from a researcher's perspective and innovator, and so I think what we try to do is to put the tools in the hands of the operators to let them do their jobs as efficiently and as quickly and moving to maybe even some more remote ways of working. As Max pointed out, we hear about issues with trying to access facilities, and so, like I say, putting the tools in the hands of the operators hopefully will help, get their jobs done in all communities.
Thanks. Last question before we move to the audience. It's a bigger one, so let's see how streamlined we can keep it. Given that there are, there's knowledge gaps in kind of every area of pipeline safety, even pipelines that have been around for a very long time. But we do have these knowledge gaps around moving CO2 as part of CCUS and moving hydrogen and blends. And we have this kind of full vision that's incentivized by Congress of moving CO2 from power plants that might be dirtier and wetter than traditional CO2, and maybe pressure to move higher blends of hydrogen. How close are we from an R&D perspective at being able to move these safely versus, kind of starting off small?
Well, I'll go back to what I said earlier. It's an it depends type of answer. Fortunately or unfortunately, the good news is we are getting closer to answering a lot of the questions that need to be answered in order to have the comfort. It's all about risk level, risk tolerance, and knowledge awareness. I'm encouraged by some of the pilot programs that we see and we've been asked to be part of, where operators are taking very conservative and controlled movement into projects at scale. I think it's recognized that there needs to be some learnings at scale, but it has to be done safely and properly. And so doing more of those the right way is kind of what we're focusing on helping.
Yeah, I would agree. It does depend, but what you're seeing is that, as I said before, we're having operations being pushed faster to move products sooner by not the decision of the operators, but by governmental policy in some places around the world. So that changes the paradigm, so we don't have a choice in 2026 in one European country. They're going to be moving it, period. So what will happen in that case? All the R&D is not done, to Bill's point. All the R&D is never done, to Tony's point. It's just part of the reality is our engineers operate very conservatively. And so in this case, what they'll begin doing is over-designing. What does that mean? They'll put more safety factors on top of the system to ensure success. And as we learn more, we'll be able to back away from some of those protocols to be a more efficient, more effective way of doing things, so we can have a better system overall. So we'll see a kind of a gradual transition from where we are today to the hydrogen to CO2 transport and storage based off of conservatism. As we learn more, we'll be able to do a different approach. So no, we're not done with the research, but we're never going to be done with the research. We're still doing oil and gas research. We started back in '52. Here we are 70 years later, we're still doing it. You're always going to do more because, as I think someone pointed out earlier today, the systems are maturing and we're asking for multiple lives. Well, as you do that, there's some different conversations, and each time there's a different conversation, there's more research needed. So are we ready to move hydrogen? Probably, because we've been doing some for a while. Are we ready to move at the scale we're going to need to change our economy? Probably not. Are we ready to move CO2? Probably. Are we ready to move CO2 at the scale we're going to need? No. So that's kind of where we are in that transitionary phase. So it'll be done very cautiously, and as Tony said, selectively. There'll be a couple systems here and a couple systems there. Test out, see what the bugs are, see what we really truly know. Though also, the operators will select systems. We won't put it in all of our systems because we have concerns, as Max mentioned about hydrogen and embrittlement. We know some are probably more susceptible than others, so we'll start with those we have the best confidence in and work our way through the system. It's not a perfect answer. I wish I could say, yep, we're ready tomorrow, let's go put hydrogen and CO2 in the system. Just not at that point. But we're also not at the point saying, no, don't do anything, just stop. Because we've been doing it for a while. So let's figure out how do we do it effectively, and then we'll take a very conservative approach to getting to the finish line. That's how it's going to work.
Yeah, and it's always honestly a tough answer. Can we guarantee to the public that it will be done safely? You know, honestly, in my good conscience, I can't tell you there won't be another incident coming up. I think we try to learn as much as we can. I think it is a continuous process improvement as we're seeing some of the shift like CO2 and hydrogen as just some examples of where we're shifting again from enhanced oil recovery to some of these new technologies. You know, sometimes I look at things like in on inspection. I still don't think we have it nailed down, right? And we've been at ILI for 20 plus years at least, and we're always trying to see, okay, now can we find this different anomaly or this different other crack, and hey, now we're going to have some new materials, and now we're going to introduce some different phases of CO2. So I think we're still learning of what potentially are the degradation mechanisms of some of these aspects. So I think we need to learn about it. But I think, and I think, what Cliff said is right, to talk about the scale of what's being talked about. It will be a ramp up of additional training and learning with our resources of our inspectors and others, including the states and our training programs, and how do we shift some of those resources as well. So it will be something we have to look at. But I will say, we are committed to putting, every, authorities we have available to it to at least look at it. So.
We forgot to mention the gap earlier, and I just thought about it. We talked about CO2, dispersion modeling. So remember the video from earlier where they show that big white plume? What that was trying to do is show you how CO2 behaves once it gets out of the system. In Mississippi, we had a behavior that happened that we never planned for in our industry. The plume traveled over a mile from the pipeline. That was never, ever considered in the entire universe of pipeline operations. So these advanced studies, and Max alluded to it, that the UK HSE, Health, Safety, and Environment, has a program starting in July on dispersion modeling at the facility where they were showing that big white plume. Why is that interesting? That facility has terrain differences that we don't see in a lot of the research facilities in the U.S. We have mostly nice, beautiful, flat facilities because of what our historical need was. Now we need more of a terrain behavior to see where this plume truly goes and what the impacts may be, so we can plan better for a mile away and say, hey, we need to educate the communities that far away to make sure they know if something does happen, this is what happened. Because that was the biggest negative in the system in Satarsha, is that the emergency responders didn't know what they were responding to. So when people came back not feeling well, they didn't know what to attribute it to or how to treat it appropriately. And same for the doctors and the workforce there in the hospitals. They just didn't know what they had. But if we had known better that, hey, maybe it could go up to a mile away, we would have trained that community. Here's possibly what could have happened. And when they saw multiple people come in, they can go, there's a bigger issue here. Let's figure out what that is. But they didn't even know to even think about it, and nor did the operator, because we had never seen that before in the operation of pipelines. So those are kind of things we definitely are going to spend time on, and you'll see a really significant push between now and, say, 25, completion of 25. You're going to see a lot of push on dispersion modeling, either through PHMSA, through PRCI, so GTI will get into it as well, to see where does this go, so we can say with confidence, this is the impact radius.
Yeah, and sorry, Bill, I wanted to add too, I touched on it earlier, but one of the other forward-thinking things we're trying to look at is CO2 storage. So at least in my panel, I mentioned, we don't have authority for, most of what we're talking about now is permanent storage sequestration. That's primarily EPA with their Class 6 wells, or if a state gets primacy. But there's a potential that if we get to the part of a transportation-related storage where you're potentially using that some of that might come into our authority, similar to what we have with natural gas storage wells. So pretty soon we're planning on awarding an interagency agreement with Department of Interior to look at aspects of storage, including odorization, emergency preparedness, and response. So again, we don't even have right now no one's doing the intermittent storage just yet, but we think going forward at some point that's probably going to be a reality coming in. And I think offshore storage will become a reality at some point, which we may or may not have a piece in it, depending on where jurisdiction ends with us and goes to the Department of Interior. But those are some of the things we're looking at, both with Department of Energy and also some of our international colleagues as well, because they have a lot of experience too with a lot of their aspects right now are going to offshore storage, at least right now. So
that's a good point. And PRCI is doing more work in storage in the North Sea, where some of our members are. We'll be talking to them about what they're doing in the North Sea. where potential most of their CO2 is going to be stored in the North Sea storage caverns that are in peak gas fields.
Okay, we have a couple mics ready to go for some audience questions.
Can't see anybody. I'm sure there's audience out there.
Hi. So, I mean, what I understand from the comments that were just made was that, in a sense, I think what, especially Speaker Noel was saying, was that the IRA is basically incentivized industry to go faster than where the science is on safety. Is that a fair assessment of what I just heard? And Speaker also talked about the need for kind of conservative approach. Here in Louisiana, I mean, there's already over 2,000 carbon capture projects being rolled out. Many of them, most of them, I think, are planning to reuse, at least in part, natural gas pipelines. And they seem to be moving forward quite quickly. So it seems to not be the conservative approach, that you're talking about. And I'm wondering, should Louisiana residents feel safe that these are kind of moving forward so quickly?
That's a great question, and it really depends on the phase that it's moving in. So the gaseous phase of CO2, which is probably the majority of your projects, is probably the gaseous phase. That's a pretty well understood science and a pretty mature distribution process. We understand that. The only unknown really for the gaseous phase that we have to do, which is not that much really, is the constituents. Where is the gas coming from and what the feedstocks are? That's not unusual for natural gas. We have the same behavior. So the science behind CO2 movement in the gaseous phase is fairly mature. It's when you get to the dense phase, we have some bigger questions on and a little bit concerns. You began with the IRA, and is it pushing us too fast? I think in the US we're okay. My concern is more our European members who are moving much more aggressively than we are. We're not being dictated in the US to move hydrogen by 2026. We're not even close to that. Whereas our European members are being told that that's what they have to do. In the US, from what I've seen from the IRA, it seems to have more of a measured approach than what I'm seeing from our partners across the pond. So I feel pretty good about that one so far.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I heard some of the panels earlier today about the concern with the state authorities, the DNR, some of those aspects, at least in Louisiana. But I can tell you, at least from the pipeline safety aspect, Louisiana is one of our, if anyone doesn't know, we do certifications. Most states have gas certification, which, the gas go into your houses. But there's fewer states that have liquid certification where they can, if a line begins and ends in a state, they have certification for hazardous liquid. Louisiana is one of those that has that certification. It usually goes through various evaluation periods for a state to get that certification. So I personally have confidence in the Louisiana pipeline safety program. They do also have experience of highly volatile liquids, which CO2 is very similar, where it does significant phase changes. I will say similar that they probably need, like any of us, as we get to a scaling that we're talking about, potentially more resources. We help fund some of the state programs, so maybe we have to look at that. Do we have to shift some of our funding just to help some of these states that are going to be taking on more and more of this? So, and I know again, I've heard some concerns about it, but I do have confidence in our state pipeline safety authority folks that are at least doing the transportation aspect of it. But I know that's a different piece than some of the other concerns we heard about with the injection wells and things like that. But. And sorry, I would have said California. California is another one. I met some of those other, some of the other stakeholders there as well. But California State Fire Marshal is another entity with the states that they also have hazardous liquid certification in California. So, yeah.
Okay, Bill. Travis Hallam, Three Village Tribes Pipeline Authority. When you were talking about pipelines and the safety, pipelines pose a more significant environmental threat because of the large volumes. But for us, on Fort Berthold, where the Bakken came into play, it saved over 100 lives in the past 5 years by having the Dakota Access take 5,000 trucks a day off of the road. And that also carries over to rail. Before that pipeline came into play, the oil, non-native owned, right in the middle of our town that we were exposed to, that's what killed 47 people up in La Magenta, Canada, through the rail incident over there. So that's 150 people right there alone, that lives that could have been saved by having pipelines. So yeah, there's obviously a risk with it, but the amount of lives it saved is significant in the transport of this product. They got to be held accountable. They got to be built responsibly, but I don't want to throw them under the bus and say they're not of value. You know, we have to have balanced infrastructure.
Right.
We got to have balanced rail, roads, and pipelines.
No, the infrastructure, just like the energy mix, has to be balanced. There's not a silver bullet saying we're going to do hydrocarbons forever, we're going to do hydrogen forever. It's a mix of the blend. At the end of the day, it's a mosaic of energy. When we do transport, it has to be compounded and thought about what we're talking about. Pipelines have an intrinsically safer mode than rail, truck, or shipping because they just go through more populous areas consistently. Like you said, the number of trucks you pulled off the road because of pipelines, that's a huge delta. But we've got to think about the totality of the opportunity, what we're trying to do. Otherwise, we're cutting our hand off to this because we can. We've got to be very mindful of this. Our future isn't one fuel. Our future isn't one mode of transportation. We've got to be very cognizant of that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Travis and Cliff, and it is, and I really appreciate your example that I don't doubt, but it is a nuanced discussion, and so I'm definitely foreseeing a panel next year so we can get into this more, and I'll be in touch about that, Travis.
Hello, I'm Maury Johnson. I'm with the Preserve Monroe and Power Coalition in Southern West Virginia, and I truly want to say that this is my third conference in 3 weeks. I've been home exactly 12 hours in 3 weeks.
I'll join you in that one, so it'll be the same thing.
Yeah, so I truly want to applaud the industry and PHMSA and some of these awesome universities I've talked to who are truly seem like pipeline safety is their truly interest. But as if any organization or industry, when one bad actor in your group does something that's not reasonable, I don't know, for about lack of a, it gives all of you a black eye. I'm dealing with a situation now where every expert I've talked to says you can't do something, it's not practical, it's bad, and then a company says, well, it's impractical. It means it costs them a lot of money to do something that everybody says they should do. The industry needs to curtail those people in and say, you're giving us all a black eye. They're using us to you all to batter us. And the industry needs to step up and force those people that's doing that kind of stuff to do what's right.
That's a great observation, and the mantra you hear quite often in our industry is one fail, we all fail. And it's a true statement, and it's something we gotta be very mindful of, and there's a lot of really good operators who are working aggressively to raise all boats. But you're right, one boat goes the wrong way, it takes everything with it. Yep.
We got time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Charlie Davidson. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a CCS project that is just come up in our area from phase 1 is from 3 power plants. They're going to be putting a pipeline across the Carquinez Straits through a marshland area. And phase 2 regards the refineries. We have 5 refineries in our area, so there'll be 8 facilities ultimately in the CCS project. And so I have 2 kind of questions, both related. The amine systems where they pull out chemically the CO2, they also use for hydrogen sulfide and stuff. How does that, what is the difference between the purity of the carbon dioxide coming out of a natural gas fired power plant versus a refinery? And also related to the presence of any water inside the CO2 pipeline system, if any kind of phase changes or any kind of different effects of the different sources of carbon dioxide would affect carbonic acid formation and corrosion inside the pipelines. Thank you.
And I'll just add first that the second part, yeah, water and CO2 makes carbonic acid. I don't know if there's many scientists that would disagree with that. So there's a concern if there's any kind of extra constituents, particularly if water, that could create carbonic acid, which can create, some additional internal. The first part, yeah, I think there's some arguments about, what's cleaner versus not, where it's being captured. And I think that's part of our learning is what are the different constituents of that versus other unique aspects, for instance, as your any H2S content or some of that, which create other issues as well. So I think we're still learning. I don't know if we're at a point yet of what's one better than the other, but I don't know if anyone else can talk about some of the constituents depending on where it's captured from.
Well, the impurity issue came up a lot at your R&D forum, Max, and refinery versus being pulled off of a smokestack. The bigger issue is the majority of CO2 today being moved around is naturally occurring CO2. So regardless, both of those new sources are going to present trace constituents that need to be evaluated. So definitely on the radar screen of us researchers to look at how to first, what is it we need to detect at what levels, and then of course the impact it can have on the various materials at their operating conditions.
And I'll just add too, this is one part of our existing regulations, which maybe we can clarify it further with different phases, but there are some parts of our general regulations that says it has to be compatible for the fluid or material that's being transported. So if it would be falling under 195, which it probably would be under supercritical right now, they'd still have to follow that general requirement. And again, California is one of those states. If I know the system, it begins and ends in a state, that would be under the California State Fire Marshal. So they would be inspecting that line.
I want to thank everybody. Thank you to the three of you for the great, frank discussion. I really appreciate the perspectives you brought. I hope everybody learned something.